All right. Sorry about the delay. It looks like we are all good to go, and a few people are logging on now. We've had several messages, so hopefully everyone will get the information now that we are live. So I'd like to welcome you both to our first attempt at this live stream. So my name is Tara Barrett, and I work here with the rooms. And today we have with us Terry Bishop Sterling and Keelan O'Leary. Terry Bishop Sterling is a professor of history with Memorial University, whose research interests include social history, women's history, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Keelan O'Leary is the manager of NONIA for the past 5 years. As manager, she's responsible for strategy, business growth, operations, and financial results. So I'd like to hand it off to Terry, who I believe is going to share her screen and show a PowerPoint all about NONIA and the history of NONIA for the past 100 years.
Okay. So can everybody see my screen? Are we good there, Sarah? Can you see the screen, PowerPoint?
Sorry, what was that, Terry?
Did everybody see the PowerPoint?
I cannot currently see the PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint? I've got it here, so I can haul it up.
Can you give me control of this, Tara? Okay. I guess I have to do it both. Okay, so just as an outline, I'm going to talk about the foundation of NONIA and then just sort of talk about general chunks. For the most part, I'm going to just try to speak to the screen rather than reading the script, which I do have, but to try to save a little time. So I'll look at the first period, 1920 to 1934, which is called knitting for nurses, the nursing period. Then the Great Depression, knitting for flour. World War II, Confederation, and the challenges and new opportunities that that brought. And then from 1949 on, diversification and adaptation. And I'll be leaving certainly the more recent period to Keelan because I not really had a chance to do a lot of research into that period, as you can all imagine. It's been hard to get some research done these days. First of all, the emphasis in the beginnings, and I think you have to really look at World War I and what came out of World War I. Certainly, we've heard the phrase, home fit for heroes, and there was this, greater expectation of government and society generally taking care of the needs of individuals and communities. In different lines, that didn't really lead to a lot of expansion of government activity. Even if they had the will, they didn't have the money. So what you did see is expansion of support for organizations such as NONIA, Rental Association, the Child Welfare Association. So with a little bit of money from government, these volunteer workers did a lot of good work and expanded support for their community in many areas. Another thing that came out of the war often does, I'm concerned about the young and the next generation. As a lot of you probably know, almost half of the men who tried to volunteer in World War I were rejected on medical grounds. So this is not an uncommon thing that came out of the Boer War in England and led to a child welfare movement because after all, you have to have soldiers for the next war. And then the final thing was the growth of women's activism. Women have always been active supporters of their community through their churches and other groups and just played a neighborly this. But they did it on an unprecedented scale during the war, particularly through the Women's Patriotic Association. And Marco Dooley has written about this and how it did lead to, bigger and more vigorous women's organizations in the interwar period. Then we're looking at two women who were particularly influential in starting the war. I told my students that the best thing the pre-Confederation governors ever did for Newfoundland was to bring along their wives. And these are two.
Sorry to interrupt, Terry. We're getting a few comments that you're a bit quiet. Is there any way that you can turn yourself up?
Oh, sorry. I don't usually get that.
Maybe down in your settings for your microphone?
Yeah.
Or if you can just speak even a little bit louder?
I have to do it without losing trying to get to the I'm at 100%. Okay, I will try to speak up because I am at 100% on my things, okay? So Constance Harris was the wife of the governor in 1920, and she lived with her husband around the province and was really quite appalled at the lack of medical care, maternity care, and determined to do something about it. Elsie Harris was her successor and was the one that they put the I in NONIA. So Constance Harris decided to form an outcourt nursing committee including some prominent people in St. John's, and they worked with an overseas nursing committee, which recruited a couple of nurses to work in Outport, Newfoundland. The initial nurses were to be paid for by a government grant of about $2,000, by some subscriptions from interested parties, and particularly by contributions from the community. From the beginning, this was important to them. Having trouble using doesn't seem to want to get in. And the other thing was the desire to help people help themselves. So, they could say it's not a charity. And Harris, in a speech in St. John, trying to sort of reassure supporters and get support for the project, said there are many in Newfoundland who feel a great deal too much has been done in the way of providing treatment free of charge to those who could very well afford to pay for it. This is certainly a upper class bias for sure. How's the sound here now? Doing better? I have my mic on off, so.
It's a little bit better.
Okay, I'll bring it in a little and see if we can do it. After the first couple of years, though, and it was a post-war depression, it was difficult for communities to contribute their share of the nurse's salary. Ideally, they had hoped for 75%. That never really happened, but communities had made contributions, $300 or $400, but they found it hard to keep that up. So Lady Allardyce looked at home industries in Faroe Islands and Shetland, and where knitting had been used by women to earn money for their communities, to pay for medical services and other things. So she decided that this would be a good idea for Newfoundland. So the idea is that any community that wanted a nurse would also have an industrial center. NONIA would provide material to be knitted into, and initially it was particularly knitting, into products that would be sold. The money would go back into the community for the most part, after expenses, so that the women then would have money to pay the nurses' salaries. In 1925, NONIA was very pleased with the contributions from the communities. They made at this point, that it completed the circle, increased sales, and increased payments to knitters, and the latter in turn enabled the nursing centers to meet their proportion of the salaries and expenses of nurses. By 1929, which is the peak of the nursing, there were 16 nurses. Here you'll see 14 centers, and they said there was one also in the Hampton Hospital, which I've never heard of. So if anybody has any insight on that, I'd appreciate hearing about it. So you can see Hens Harbor, Joe Besser, Lanley, Port Saunders, Ramia. So some of these were more tighter communities or tighter areas. Some districts were huge. The nurse in Port Saunders was the only medical care for about 100 miles around. She was particularly became kind of the nurse at Port Saunders became a particular sort of project of the branch of Porterbrook, which started relatively early and sold NONIA goods and supported the nurses. So they kept in touch with her, sent her Christmas boxes, that kind of thing. Here's just an idea of some of the activities that NONIA nurses did between 1925 and 1928. So in 1928, for example, they had 12 nurses who made well over 18,000 home visits, treated over 1,000 patients, and officiated 166 births. What did the nurses do? They did, as well as the maternity care, and they did have to have special training in maternity care. They treated illnesses, accidents. They did public health work, so talking about the need for clean water. They did antenatal care, child welfare work. They distributed powdered milk and children's clothing sent to NONIA by friends, both in Newfoundland and elsewhere. Like nurses in the city, they complained a lot about the dental care that they had to do. They all hated pulling teeth, and the situation with people's teeth was so bad that normally that was all they could really do. So the nurses' wide array of activities, it naturally attracted a certain type of woman. A nurse who wasn't content to work in a hospital, but who really wanted the adventure and perhaps had a missionary deal as well. Nurse McMahon of Garnish in 1928 There are some fairly well-known nurses. Perhaps the best known is Myra Bennett. Myra Brinsley, she was when she came. She was one of the original NONIA nurses, and she married a local man. She was not the only NONIA nurse to do that, and then retired. Although I don't think nurses in rural communities ever actually retired. And she, for a long time, was a very well-known and well-trusted healer in her area, Daniel Turber, and she delivered 3,000 babies over her lifetime. Another was Dorothy Cherry, who became very well known after the 1929 tsunami on the Burin Peninsula for the tireless work she did over the next week or so. While the industrial side of it was initially meant to support the nurses, it had took on a life of its own. So you can see by 1928 there were 44 industrial centers, even though there were only 12 nurses that year. So it obviously was used to help the nurses, but it was also used for other needs in the community. So you see that as sort of payment to workers. Now that's an average. Some would have got more, some less. $8.38. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in those days that meant a lot. I mean, that was flour and other needs for the family. The other aspect of the NONIA industrial side, which developed alongside the knitting, was weaving. And this was particularly associated with Pool's Cove in Fortune Bay, under the leadership of the congregational minister there, Hugh McDermott, and his wife Gertrude. There, very early on, Lady Alderdice visited there, and she arranged for a skilled weaver to go there with the help of the Grenfell Association. And then the next 2 summers, an expert came from Toronto and brought their looms and taught weaving. And for the next 2 or 3 years, people came to Pool's Cove from all over Fortune Bay, and they stayed for a while and learned to weave. Certainly, first under these outside experts, but eventually under women in Pool's Cove. And the men coming on the looms. When the woman from Toronto was coming for the second summer, she said, well, I'll have to arrange to get my loom brought. And Mr. Dermott told her, no, you don't. We have lots of looms here. By the end of the 1920s, there were 19 looms in the community, but only 4 or 5 were being used for NONIA work. So again, this shows that, the initial impetus for, support of the nursing really led to other things which supported the community in many ways. I like this quote from McDermott, who talks about the loom room and how it helps have a community atmosphere. So you can see the women coming in every Wednesday evening. They gather. It's where they discuss all kinds of things. They have regular meetings, tea, somebody read a book. And these meetings became a central point in their lives that they looked forward to from week to week. And from the time they closed in the late spring until they opened again in the early autumn. And that is certainly a point to make that a lot of the work for NONIA women did through the winter, because as we know, rural women, between taking care of their gardens and helping with the fish and all of the difficult walls to just do basic housework at that time were pretty busy through the fishing season. So I'll move on to commission government here in the end of the NONIA nurses. When 1934, as most people probably know, Newfoundland lost self-government and was ruled then by an appointed government, the commission government, which informed NONIA that they were going to take over all of the nursing, the district nursing. And this apparently was, broke people's hearts, praise, that became even more important. And NONIA could not keep up with the requests for knitting. One young girl in 1931 who was disabled, but an excellent knitter, said that she supported her whole family on what she made from NONIA. Hugh McDermott tells a story about giving a $10 check to a woman for her weaving in pool school, and it was her first check. And he met her the next day, and he said, how did it go? Were you happy with your payment? And she said, I don't know how I got home, whether on my head or my heels. We had nothing in the house. Will has made nothing this year, all but flour and other things we sorely needed. Between 1923 and 1940, NONIA paid $117,833 to women throughout Newfoundland and Labrador for their work knitting and weaving. With World War II, the first year was very difficult. Of course, nobody knew what was going on. They had disruptions in the wool supply. At least one big shipment they lost to enemy action. And they weren't quite sure what was going to happen. But from 1941 on, as the economy improved, they had a different challenge, and that was actually the challenge of keeping up enough workers. Because once the basics came into production, there was a lot more work. There was work for women. There was work for young adults in the family, and the husbands and fathers had better work. So the need to knit for NONIA was not as great. So you did see some decline there. How they responded was by offering bonuses. They didn't really like to put up the price too much because then they had to put up the price of the garments. They were also, of course, there was very little tourism during the war, so they were worried about that, but they did provide bonuses, usually about 10% a year. And that did the trick a little bit, and so by the end of the war, the numbers are coming back up, at least up to the 400s. They had dipped down to just about 300. With Confederation, they lost a couple of the benefits that they had under responsible government. They'd been able to import all the wool tariff-free, and they had free postage, and they lost that. And as the president said, in the eyes of the Canadian government, we're a business like any other, which of course they weren't. So I'm going to move on to the sort of the post-Confederation years. So Confederation did bring those challenges. On the other hand, it did bring an improved standard of living, and also more tourists. And you can see, you start to see in the records discussion of sort of national events and national conventions, for example. There was a convention of National Convention of Dentists held here, and they sold $800 worth of goods to them. And sometimes these conventions would also buy NONIA goods as part of their gifts for their guests. In 1977, they had an order of 200 sweaters for the Canada Summer Games. So, there were losses, but there were also benefits as well. These are some of the images from the NONIA collection at the Archives and Special Collections at Memorial University. And I do want to thank them for their help the last few weeks as I managed to get in for a few hours anyway. And so here's a copy of the 1940 annual report. Another interesting artifact that they have is a visitor's book from the 30s and 40s. The first names, the first date are Murray Anderson, Muriel Anderson, so that's the governor and his wife, Eleanor McPherson, who would have been the president of NONIA at the time. Isabel MacDonald, the wife of the British Prime Minister, is also in there. Throughout its history, NONIA has particularly been very well known for its high quality. And that was a problem sometimes. Whenever they started a new center, they said that always took a little bit of time because it took time for the quality to get up to their standards. But they, as you can see from this awarded to NONIA, whenever they attended different exhibitions internationally, they were always met with great interest. Just going to move through quickly now some of the great images that are in the collection. So here's American servicewomen, Air Force, would have been shopping at NONIA. I think this is about 1956. Looking out, we see a beautiful piece of cloth here. So here's the caribou sweaters, just pictures of women shopping in the store. It doesn't look all that different from what we see behind Keelan. Here's some ties on the wall, kind of a complex sweater here. I like these images because it shows that the store, the depot, was more than just a retail store. So you see women weighing wool, wrapping up packages to be sent out, and this woman is sewing probably either buttons or labels because of the buttons and the labels that sign finishing work was done at the depot. Later on, they got some requests from some communities where the women didn't particularly knit or like knitting, but they were good at hooking mats. And so they did actually add that to the repertoire in the post-confederation period. And here's a couple of patterns. And it said that the hook mats always did well with the tourists. So these are quite sweet, I think. So some children's, you sort of think that in the days before you had mass-produced children's clothing, how special these would have been, beautiful gifts. This picture on the right of a little girl in the jumper, it says the first all-over NONIA pattern, which was knit by Mrs. P. James of Hensher. You see this picture quite often. Other little sweaters that, again, would have been popular gifts for children. But the biggest sellers were women's clothing. So you see some very fine gauge cardigans here, some fancy socks, and a little shawl. This is just some promotional material. Next, sorry, it's not advancing very clearly. So, at Christmas and Easter, they had special gifts. You can see a little Christmas set there. This one is Cassie Brown, if anybody doesn't recognize her, the author. She's modeling a little Angora scarf, and she had a newspaper column in the 60s, kind of a women's page, and this is part of the story. She had encouraging people to shop at NONIA. Here's some of the woven goods. So it's some new flat tartan ties, scarves, a little purse. And these are either tea towels or they look like thick, could be a tablecloth. And the iconic caribou sweater, which for a long time was, one of their best sellers, but very complex. And because the best sellers were in Maidenford and Winterton. And if they got a new pattern or a big special order came in, because people couldn't order things to measure, they would send them first to those communities. It's just some wool going out to a knitter. It says, make and wool out. It works great. A couple of interesting things from the later period that the 1956, a new CNR ship was named the NONIA in honor of the organization. Here it's being christened in Scotland, but they did have a big celebration in St. John's with a big luncheon, and NONIA presented the CNR with a plaque, and they wine and dine the ladies. And then another big event happened in 1972 where they bought their long-term premises. They had moved during the Depression. They had moved to the Hotel Newfoundland and were there for a number of years. And then I think the 50s moved back to Waterloo. today. They celebrated their 50th anniversary. Lunches are celebrating this one with talks and presentations. Here's small one giving a class to Mrs. Winter, and this is Mrs. Hickman showing off a great artifact, which maybe I'll talk about in a little in the question and answers, which was a jeweled casket, which had been given to Lady Allardyce in 1928 when she left, and was repatriated about 1980. That's an interesting story as well. Here's some long-term knitters. This is Martha Field, Mrs. Burridge, and Mrs. John Hitchcock. I've been at a couple of annual meetings where women were honored for long-time knitting for NONIA, and people did stay at it for a very long time. I want to advance the slides. Here's some pictures. If anybody knows, this woman up in the left-hand corner it just says NONIA knitter in the collections. But I think this is Mrs. Louis Drover, and here are some members of the executive with Mrs. Lucy Burridge, and she's getting a gold watch for her 50th anniversary. So many women, as I said, knit for NONIA for decades. I've been at ceremonies to witness this, but also others worked a long time for NONIA. Beatrice Moore, for example, worked as the depot manageress, as she was called, for 30 years. Similarly, Phyllis Winter described leadership of NONIA as almost hereditary, with daughters working under their mothers in the organization until they too assumed leadership. I'm interested generally in women's labor, both paid and unpaid, and how it's so often overlooked. NONIA reminds us of its importance in providing first health care and then economic opportunities for women to help themselves, their families, and their communities. Opportunities very much lacking in early 20th century Newfoundland. It built on craft skills that they often enjoyed and also used to clothe their families and to decorate their homes. Remember those extra looms, as Pools called. This missionary aspect of NONIA, this sort of long dedication of both knitters and volunteers and staff, seems to be something that has persisted. So I think it was not just another business after 1949. The organization's 100th anniversary in 2020 certainly brought unprecedented challenges, but hopefully its deep roots and experience adapting to new times and new circumstances will help it through this difficult time as well, so that it can continue its legacy as a home ministry, a female-led institution, and an important historic and cultural icon. Thank you.
That one up there. Will you be getting a bigger one or not very likely those ones?
Well, and I think there might be some people in the background perhaps, but thank you so much, Terry. That was wonderful. I know there were a few technical issues at the beginning, and I know our sound quality was perhaps not our best, so we apologize. It's kind of a test run for us, but I'd like to welcome Keelan, who's the manager at NONIA. Thanks.
Thanks, Tara. Can you hear me well? All right, great. Thank you for that. And thanks, Terry, for that really interesting presentation. I've heard you speak a couple of times before, but every time I hear you speak, there's more little nuggets to appreciate. So it's really great. An interesting coincidence, today is actually our 101st anniversary. And I don't know if you had planned it that way, but it was 101 years ago today that they had the first meeting at Government House, first official meeting to convene NONIA and get it off the ground. So that's some nice symmetry there. So here we are 101 years later, and we're still a not-for-profit, still governed by a volunteer board of, right now it's 15 members. We have a staff full-time, about 5 people year-round, but we do have more seasonally in summer and Christmas time. Hand knits are still our core product. We make sweaters. You can see some of them behind me, sweaters and accessories for babies to adult. And we do still have a little weight weaving, and we carry some other handicrafts made by local people. So here we are 101 years later, and we have essentially the same business model, which I think is pretty remarkable. I don't know how many organizations could go through that amount of time with the same business model. So the way the process still works, we send orders to the knitters from here. It all starts on the 3rd floor here at Water Street. We send the orders with the wool and the patterns to the knitters, and they send them back when they're done. And they get paid by piecework. So for every item they knit for us, that's what they get paid for. And then when they're done, they send the work back in here to St. John's, and it's checked by our quality control department. And if the NONIA standards are met, then the NONIA label gets sewn in, but only then. We currently have about 150 knitters working for us regularly. And of those, more than 20 of them have been knitting for us for over 25 years. And 7 of them have been knitting for us for over 50 years, some of them for over 70 years. So it's pretty remarkable, the history and the changes that those knitters would have seen over the years. So our retail shop is located on the corner of Water Street and George Street in downtown St. John's. And this is this location that we've been in since 1958. So usually people don't have to ask what the address is. They just know where to find us. We do some wholesale selling, mostly through a couple of outlets at Trinity, where we put our goods seasonally. And of course, we also have a web shop. We recently relaunched that, and we feel that there's really some good potential for growth there because, of course, so much it was moving online even before the pandemic, but now especially so. There's a lot of demand for our products outside the province. Hand knits are not common in a lot of other places, although Newfoundlanders are quite familiar with them because many of us had aunts or grandmothers who were able to knit some of these things. A lot of visitors are just gobsmacked when they come in and see all this wonderful these hand knit items. In fact, last fall we were featured in the Globe and Mail as one of the local places to buy Christmas gifts. And we just got swamped for 3 weeks with phone calls and emails for people looking for snowflake mittens and things like that. So that was pretty exciting, and it really shows that there is still the demand and the interest in these items that have been handmade. So as Terry mentioned, last year was our centenary, and we had been planning for it for a few years, of course, and several projects that we undertook. And one of them, of course, was the exhibit at the Rooms, and this presentation is given in connection with that exhibit. Our legacy project will be a bronze sculpture, which is currently being sculpted by Morgan MacDonald, who's a well-known local sculptor. And it will be unveiled on the grounds of Government House in late August. So stay tuned. That's will be quite a milestone for us. NONIA still does have that connection to Government House. The Lieutenant Governor is our patron currently, and we normally have our annual general meetings at Government House. Things have been different, of course, in the last couple of years, but we hope to resume when things go back to normal. Another fun project that we did for our centenary was to make up a blanket from squares made by any of our knitters that wanted to participate. So they were all invited to send in a square, a 5-inch square, and one of our dedicated board members, Katie Noseworthy, connected all the squares together and made a blanket, which we have here on Water Street if you're interested in seeing it. But we also made up postcards with the image on it, and so that's just a bit of an idea what the blanket looks like. You can see that it's quite a smorgasbord of different colors and styles, and that was what was really interesting, that knitters were invited to send whatever they wanted. So what we saw in those squares was a reflection of all the different products that have been, and patterns and colors that have been made by NONIA over the years. So that's pretty neat. So in conclusion, I really just wanted to summarize by saying that NONIA's mission really now is about fostering the community of quality knitting skills in the province. But also another important mission for us now really is to promote NONIA itself as a cultural landmark, because there's so much history there and so much interest in it. It really does contribute to the province's unique identity and therefore our tourism industry. One of the best things I think about being associated with NONIA is the sentimental attachment that so many customers have with it. It was neat that Terry brought up this point about, at Confederation, they said we were just like any other business, because I really don't think so. When customers come through the door, you just pick this up from them already, their attachment to NONIA. If they're local folks, a lot of times it's the fact that they might have grown up in NONIA knitwear, or they may have had family members who knit for NONIA, grandmothers, mothers, aunts, and so on. But tourists, the ones who, as I mentioned, if they haven't been here before, they're just amazed by the handwork. But then when we hear from them later, when they go back home and they may call us or email us to order something, they have to tell us about, when they were in NONIA and the trip they had to Newfoundland, and they can't wait to get back. And it's all tied together. Their experience at NONIA was tied together with their memories of their trip with the province. So it's a very nice thing to be part of that and keeping that alive for people. And we certainly look forward to being able to welcome visitors back in the shop again. So when things get back to normal. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm just checking our Facebook now. I don't believe that we currently have any questions. I guess maybe I'll just ask. I know I personally purchased NONIA products for gifts and for new babies usually, or different things like that. So I'm wondering if either of you has a favorite product.
I guess for me, it would probably be the snowflake mitts, because that's the thing that I associate with my childhood. I had, multiple different pairs of snowflake mitts as my hands grew. And I love the way that the patterns mix the different colors together. You can have so many different combinations. And it's really, and plus they're very effective, as with the 2 layers of wool in them, they end up being nice and warm.
I like the dragons that, just what's very fine. Dusty pastel, not baby pastel. But the pinks and blues that are there are so warm. And it never goes out of style, just so classic.
And I guess to play off of that, do either of you knit? Keelan, I know you work at NONIA, and Terry, I know you're a professor, but are either of you knitters?
I'm a dabbler. I dabble on the side occasionally. I did knit a couple of squares for the blanket. That was right up my alley. A short, simple project, and I was able to get it done and move on to the next one. So that was perfect for me.
Yeah, actually, it was funny when I was in the archives working. I was saying to Linda White there, I want to knit again. I got to get back on my knitting. I used to knit quite a lot, and I made cable sweaters, and I did a sweater once. Girls holding hands, little skater sweater kind of thing. But I kind of like the last few years when I've done it just to try and relax. It's been, cotton dishcloth. So I'm sort of heading into retirement now. So I think I'm going to pick it up again. I told my sister, who is a very good knitter, that I'm coming down for a refresher.
I might just mention in connection with that, Terry showed the picture of the caribou sweater and how iconic that was for, almost a generation in NONIA. So when we were looking at centenary projects and wondered what could we introduce in the way of a product that would be our centenary product, we thought it would be great to have something with a caribou, but there's a couple of issues. Mainly, as she mentioned, it's very complicated to knit, and we didn't have any knitters who are currently doing it. So what we did was introduce our cuff socks and matching mitts with the caribou. So if people feel that they need to get themselves a NONIA caribou, for posterity's sake, now you can get it on them on mitts and on cuffed socks.
So like the ones with the curling stones on it, I saw the pictures of those.
Yes.
I would like those. I said, that's
Yeah.
what it's like.
Yeah.
And it looks like we do have a question, which is for the, I guess, the real wool. Where is that usually sourced?
That's a great question. Years ago, it all came from Britain, but now none of it does. It all comes from, well, from west of us. The nearest source is New Brunswick. We knit a lot of our goods from wool that comes from Briggs and Little, the mill in New Brunswick, which is, I'm pretty sure it's the oldest mill in Canada, and it's even older than NONIA. And we knit a variety of our socks or accessories and sweaters from wool that comes there. And some of that wool would come from Newfoundland sheep because they buy all their wool from the region. Then we get some of the well-known brands that people would know, Patton's, Bernat. Some of that wool that comes from a distributor in Ontario. And then our fisherman's wool, which is very popular, is we buy from the United States.
Okay, one more question's coming in.
Is there a place to see images of past NONIA items like the caribou sweater?
Okay, so the question is just if there's a place that you can go to see past images of items from NONIA's past. So they were asking, about the caribou sweater or about other objects that I guess were significant throughout the past.
Well, of course, the exhibit that's on at the rooms now was designed to extract a sample of that, but it's just a relatively small sample. We have a number of other items in our possession, but they're not on display. Terry may know if there's any in the archives. So in her picture, she had more images in her presentation now than I've seen in any other one place.
Yeah, there's some on Facebook and on the NONIA webpage, but yeah, they are in the archives. For sure, there's some quite pretty images there.
Yes, and I guess for anybody who's watching and doesn't know, like Keelan mentioned, we do have an exhibition of NONIA up on our 4th floor, which does have, like you said, just a small kind of selection of items. So actually on that note, I guess my question is, how did NONIA go about, I guess, working in conjunction perhaps with Maureen, our curator? How did you go about choosing what went in that display?
Well, it was a committee process and it did take a fair while. We started off by looking at what we had here. So a group of us here pulled all together the things that have been donated back to us over the years and that we have held on to, and then tried to decide where the gaps were. And not surprisingly, the gaps were mainly in things that were more than 50 years old. So then we put out a call on social media for people to offer, let us know if they had items that were more than that many years old. And we did get a few. One of them is in the exhibit. It's a sweater that's 70 years old. It's actually a caribou sweater, and it's still in amazing condition. But yeah, then was the hard part. Then we got together with Maureen and we looked at the, several dozens of items that we had and tried to pick. I think we ended up having to pick just 12 or 14 items. So it was tough. It's like trying to choose between your children, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you can just quickly pull up my last slide. There were a couple of images that just came. They were just in the little 1928 annual report. And sort of my question is if anybody knows who the artist is, because there don't seem to be any photographs of this. And I imagine that they were posters used for promotion. Don't know if they were just pencil drawing or paintings, but I think they're absolutely gorgeous. Undoubtedly a local artist, and I don't know if anybody out there sort of recognized the style or anything that say this was from 1928. But man, if you still have those down there, particularly colored posters, I think you could sell those for they're just beautiful.
I haven't ever seen those before.
I think we just have one last comment from online, which was just, I I guess maybe wishful thinking or a hope. Somebody had made a comment just saying that it'd be great to see some of those images or some of the images shown in Terry's work. And also I've just passed articles somewhere online. I know MUN's, I guess, archives has, I know there's a collection of NONIA items in there, and I don't know how much the photos that you took, I don't know if you drew mainly from that, Terry, but I guess some people have said, you know, if we could see it somewhere online too, that would be great.
Some are from the digital archives on the library website, but those are the better images. Those are, you know, pictures of old magazines, you know, Dex Wash story about an error or something like that. But the better colored images are all in the collection. So, you know, it's certainly a project that we can talk about with the archives. It shouldn't be that difficult.
And I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that MUN's digital archives, I think there's like the finding aid, so you can kind of find out a general overview of what that collection consists of. If you were looking for something in particular, you can go to collections.mun.ca and have a look.
Yeah, there's a way to finding aid, so there's a little, just very brief history and then sort of a detailed account. I think there are 3 archive boxes and then another small box, which is where the photographs were. But there's lots of lovely images. That one of the American service women threw me for a minute because I thought, well, I don't think that there were any women posted here in World War II, not American women or Canadian women. And so I had to do being a skilled researcher, well-trained researcher, I Googled it. And found out that the Women's Air Force, the American Women's Air Force, was not created until 1948. I just Googled badges to find out who it was. It, clearly was stylized, stripes, so I knew they were American. So that would be, and that image was mixed in. It wasn't dated, but it was in others that were dated at 1956. So that would make sense.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions and comments that we had. So just a big thank you to you both. Again, this was a bit of a test run for us, live streaming ourselves. So hopefully we'll work out some of the kinks, and next time we'll get started on time with great audio and we'll be good to go. But thank you both.
Okay.
Thank you, Tara, for organizing it.
Okay. Thank you.